How do we go beyond the divisions in our society?
Welcome to the Hub for Important Ideas. I'm Steve James.
And I'm Ken Swain. This episode is called A House Divided, Part 2. We're looking for an explanation for our divided country that goes beyond the standard political, social, historical, and economic explanations that we're hearing all around us. We want to look at our polarized society in terms of a social, psychological perspective.
We're going to play for you a recent conversation we had with Dr. Sheldon Solomon. Sheldon Solomon, Ph.D., is a social psychologist at Skidmore College. He is best known for co-developing terror management theory with Jeff Greenberg and Tom Pasinski, which is concerned with how humans deal with their own sense of mortality. He's the author or co-author of over 100 articles and several books, and has been featured in various films, radio interviews, and the award-winning YouTube documentary series Conversations with Solomon. He co-authored the book The Worm at the Core on the Role of Death in Life with Greenberg and Pasinski. He recently appeared in the documentaries Planet of the Humans and Unfit. Here's the conversation with Dr. Solomon. Sheldon, welcome to the Hub for Important Ideas.
Great to be back.
Oh, great.
Hi, Sheldon.
Hello, Ken.
Thank you so much for being our guest once again. It's always a pleasure to have you on our show. Sheldon, the title of this episode is A House Divided, Part 2. Very clever title we came up with. We've been looking for an explanation for our divided country that goes beyond the standard political, social, historical, what we talked about the last time. And we want to look at our polarized society in terms of the social, psychological perspective that you bring to it.
Sounds good.
Okay. So we'd like to read a few passages from The Worm at the Core. Have you heard of that one?
Vaguely familiar.
In the fall of 2010, conservative pundits implored their followers to steer clear of the H1N1 flu vaccination because they distrusted the federal government. Some claim the vaccination was a part of a plot by then-President Obama to infect the masses in order to hasten a socialist revolution, produce infertility, and keep track of the public through nano-sized microchips slipped into the vaccinations. That was 12 years ago. Here we are in 2022, and this sounds a lot like the U.S. anti-vaxxers in the midst of the COVID pandemic. How do you respond, and how do you explain this?
Great question. What I would say in terms of explanation is, wow, there's nothing new under the sun. And what I mean by that is that America has a very long history of right-wing paranoid conspiracy theories, probably predating the Salem witch trials. And moreover, this kind of conspiratorial paranoia tends to be amplified during historical moments when existential concerns are apt to be aroused. And so, for example, in the last epidemic with Obama, there was research done by some of our colleagues showing that people who tend to be suspicious of traditional medicine, when they're reminded of their mortality, they're less inclined to seek medical attention when they're sick. They're more reliant on faith healers or prayer. And this is, as you know, prototypical with regard to terror management theory as it was designed to corroborate Ernest Becker's view, which is that our concerns about death give rise to potentially debilitating anxiety that we try to manage by embracing our cultural worldviews that give us a sense that life has meaning and that we have value. Well, fast forward to the present moment, and actually I should back up a bit, and I wish I wasn't the human Etch-a-Sketch at this point, because every time I shake my head, I can't remember what happened 30 seconds ago. But there are some folks who have written about why conspiracy theories tend to become prominent during pandemics and why charismatic and populist leaders tend to become more potent and powerful under those conditions. And I think this is completely compatible with like a Becker terror management theory point of view, because the argument is that, pandemics are fuzzy. Germs are invisible. You can't hear them. But ideological demagogues are plenty visible and audible. And when an alpha male generally puffs out his chest allegorically and says, only I can fix it, people understandably sometimes would prefer to be persuaded by that kind of veneer of self-confidence. But of course, that happens at the expense ultimately of their well-being. So fast forward to the present pandemic, and as you all know, former President Trump, it was just part of his ideological conception of things that the virus wasn't bad. It was as mild as the flu. Wearing a mask is a sign of weakness, or even worse, a sign that you might be a Democrat. And most folks, I think, will remember when Trump had COVID and then he got out of the White House and he's on the porch of his quarters and he rips off his mask triumphantly. You may know that that's not what he wanted to do. He wanted to have a fucking Superman shirt on and to get out of the ambulance and to take off his shirt and reveal the Superman costume. But he was talked out of that by evidently one of the few people that had some influence over him. All right, but what's the point? The point is that here we are in a supremely ironic death spiral of sorts. So we've already established that existential anxieties, when they arise, that we tend to cling tenaciously to our worldview. And for the average Republican, that worldview is embodied in former President Trump. And so it shouldn't surprise us. And so there's a study that came out a year ago, and I'll spare you the details, even though these are great researchers. In 2020, they looked at 15 million smartphones a day for a couple of months, and all over the United States. And they measured social distancing, which is easy to do with smartphone technology. And what they found is that you could predict social distancing as a function of support for either President Trump or Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden. In simple English, the more people supported Trump, the less likely they were to social distance. This, in turn, was directly responsible. And when I say that, I mean statistically, the absence of social distance was related to an increase in cases and an increase in death. So here you have people, not necessarily morons, but clinging tenaciously to a Trumpian worldview in order to minimize death anxiety that has the result of actually killing them. Right. But just to be sure we're all equally horrified, it's not only killing them, it's killing us too, because in another recent study, a very clever experimenter looked at support for former President Trump as a function of mortality rates in different local communities. And what they found is that the higher the death rate, the greater the support for Trump. And this was true even for people who reported being moderate or liberal. All right, just think about that for a second. And that's why I say we're in a death spiral. Here you've got Trump telling 75 or 100 million Americans not to worry about the virus, and they're doing that, which is pumping up death, which is in turn increasing support for Trump. I would say that it's brilliant if you can watch my fingers doing the air quotes, brilliant in the same sense that Hitler was brilliant in terms of constructing conditions to ensure their perpetuation in power by keeping people in a perpetual state of existential angst.
Amazing.
Sheldon, here's another quote from The Worm at the Core. Attempts to eradicate the evil other fan the flames of conflict by arousing death fears in those on the receiving end, not only through direct death threats to their physical existence, but also by the psychological humiliation of being belittled and dehumanized. How can people maintain their sense of being significant contributors to a meaningful world while having their homeland appropriated and being forced to relinquish traditional beliefs and adopt an alien way of life, or while witnessing treasured traditions and artifacts absorbed into the dominant culture in demeaning ways, or while serving as a cultural caricature? This paragraph was written to describe historical invaders or people intent on eradicating evildoers, but it can also be used to describe our fellow Americans who have different beliefs and worldviews not shared by other Americans. When coastal elites describe half the country as flyover people and rednecks, the heartland citizens can't help but feel humiliated, belittled, and dehumanized. You remember the New Yorker magazine cover in 1976 that just showed the East Coast and the West Coast and everything in the middle was just not even there? It was supposed to be a satirical look at a New Yorker's 1970s parochialism, but it now appears to be an example of 21st century East Coast elitism. Who in heartland America would not look at this image as anything less than ethnocentric superiority? And how do you see that?
Yeah.
Next.
Yes.
Yes. Although what I would say is, yes, that's a good point and an important one, as long as we stipulate that it cuts both ways. My point would be that is surely a common trope. The idea that anything worthwhile in the U.S. is going to be on either coast, and anything in between is just a very sad state of affairs in terms of people or places. Yeah, that sure does fit the bill for a patronizing, condescending, dehumanizing view of the other. And conversely, I think it's equally true to the average person in flyover country that they have an equally unfortunate stereotypic view of the folks on the coast. And my point is there's a kernel of truth in each view. You know, prejudices and stereotypes often have a little bit of substance to them. But my concern is that, well, first of all, my concern is it would be best if we could step back, coastal people and flatlanders in the middle, and consider the possibility that these are caricatures of stereotypes that most of us have had no direct experience, either with America in the middle or on the coasts. And at the risk of sounding conspiratorial, but we're just in the mood given the last question, I think that vested interests have a very significant stake in these matters and have gone to extraordinary lengths to keep these stereotypes in place, lest people notice that they are put there to obscure the horrifying possibility that folks on the coast and in the middle of the country recognize that they have more common interests than they do differences that put them at odds with each other. To put that a little bit more particularly, I could see how the coastal elites, the educated, the cosmopolitan, the worldly, the globalized, but they've had no direct experience, again, with the middle of America. Maybe you've been to Chicago at O'Hare or had some Greek food in the city itself, but you've not seen anything else except flying over, which sure does look like a rather uninspired topography You've got the square fields with the square interstate, with every one of them having the Walmart, the Applebee's, and the Pizza Hut. And I've had many a trip where I go into a Walmart in Texas to look for something. And then a few days later, I'm in Nebraska, but I don't realize it. I just walk into another Walmart and turn down the same aisle. Now, I'm 1,000 miles away, but it really doesn't matter because it's the same thing everywhere. Well, I could see, and then, of course, the average person in these parts has watching Fox News and rarely transcends the monosyllabic utterance, and it sure seems like there is a kernel of truth to the idea that the flyover country is a bit of a waste. But that's without noticing that the flyover country, in fact, is very rich and very varied, in that people being people, there's terrible people and there's interesting people everywhere, but it is the educated, cosmopolitan, globalized elite that turned the Midwest into the horrid state of affairs, which they then take issue with. I don't know if that makes any sense, but the Midwest, the interior of the U.S., has been really devastated. And a lot of the things that the elites look down on are in fact the result of their exploitation of the very people that they then pile on by despising on top of that. But on the other hand, I could see how your Fox News watching rural Americans can look at the coastal elites and be like, wow, these are pompous and promiscuous heathens ready to impregnate any orifice, be it a bicycle seat or a fire hydrant. And that these terrible people in Manhattan are determined to take away their God and their guns. And they, too, have not been in a city. They may have been in Manhattan on 42nd Street. That's not a city. They don't notice the richness and the texture of the neighborhoods in the city, where not everybody is a globalized, highly educated elite. And I guess my point is what I've already said without taking us too far afield. I think that vested interests have a vested interest in fostering mutual hostility between red and blue folks to distract from what I believe to be the real distinction in America, and that's between those who exploit and those who are exploited.
It's an interesting theory, because the way I look at it is those divisions are there and people like Trump are exploiting them.
Yes.
So, yes, you're right. There is some bad actors involved, but they didn't create this situation. They didn't create the Rust Belt.
No, they did not.
And the very name Rust Belt implies that it's fallen apart.
No, absolutely right, Stephen. A good point. And you guys know that I don't ever listen to myself, so I can't remember if I've said this before.
We'll play it back. We got recordings.
Have we talked about Hannah Arendt and the origin of totalitarianism at any point?
We talked about her back on the Perspective show.
Okay. So
20 years ago.
So I'm really preoccupied with Arendt's book because just in affirmation of what Steve just said, she does point out that these stereotypes about a rural, less educated, more tied to the land, quote, rustic population versus the urban, cosmopolitan city dwellers, that's a common source of tension in industrialized countries.
The country mouse and the city mouse.
That's correct.
Yeah.
But again, what Arendt says is that what happens is it is about unregulated capital in pursuit of capital. And she's saying this in the 1950s. She's saying, look, here's what happens. People who are interested in maximizing revenue have no commitment to or any perceived responsibility for the communities from which they reside. And so if it's cheaper to go to Mexico or Korea in order to build things to make money, they're going to do that. And then what's going to happen is that that's going to be at the expense of the local communities that were thriving before the money moved elsewhere. But she insists what happens is that in order for this to occur, you need to explain to the people that are being disenfranchised what's happening. And of course, you can't tell them the truth, which is that we need to make money, so fuck you. So what you must do is identify an enemy, either domestic and or foreign, and declare them the all-encompassing repositories of evil responsible for your economic malaise, and in so doing, distract from what's actually happening, which is a movement of resources at the expense of local populations. And so she talks about populism as the inevitable result of global capital moving across borders in an unregulated fashion. And she says that can't happen without racism, and it can't happen ultimately without environmental destruction, and it can't happen without populist resentment, because most of the local population is unaware of what it is that has actually created the conditions responsible for their current difficulties.
And are told that they should blame the immigrants.
That's correct.
And they should blame the Sodom and Gomorrah of the elites. And they're told all these different things, a lot of misinformation. But Trump came along and said, I alone can fix it.
Yeah.
So they bought that.
Populist leaders are good at riding the resentments. They are, and I think we've talked about this in other venues, but their genius is they're the alchemists of hate. They are able to deftly manipulate their followers by transforming their anxieties from fear to rage and directing it to external sources, while again misdirecting attention from what's actually happening. Because according to Arendt, and we don't want to get too political here, what all populists have in common is incompetence and corruption.
Well, luckily ours has been very incompetent. So this brings us to a very important concept we've been wrestling with. According to Google, postmodernism is, in Western philosophy, a late 20th century movement characterized by broad skepticism, subjectivism or relativism, a general suspicion of reason, and an acute sensitivity to the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power. So Ken and I are struck by the similarity this characterization has to our 21st century society and the divisions we struggle with, we're talking about here. Would you comment on this? Are we living in a postmodern time?
Sure. Somebody said this at lunch, but I already had it written down. I think we're living in a post-modern time.
Or a post.
Yeah, we're postal at this point. Well, okay, so according to the Google definition, there were two parts there. There was the broad skepticism, subjectivism, general suspicion of reason. And then there was the followed by an acute sensitivity to the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power. Let me tackle that part, because I think that is arguably an important contribution of the so-called postmodern movement, to draw attention to the extent to which social institutions, be they political, economic, and or religious, are generally in the service of a particular ideological position with respect to maintaining power. But I mean that as a compliment to what the postmodern types are doing, noting that they're not the first to do that. And I'm not claiming to be a scholar in this regard, but, we got Karl Marx going back to the 1840s in his economic and philosophical manuscripts saying you are what you do, and that unbeknownst to us, everything that we do and everything that we want and everything that we think we want is a reflection of a particular ideological bent. And then in my world, we got Eric Fromm in the 1940s is doing the same thing in Escape from Freedom. C. Wright Mills in the 50s, you got the Power Elite. Then Marcuse in the 60s with, One Dimensional Man. Then we got the 70s, Critical Race Theory and Berger and Luckman's Social Construction of Reality. In the 90s, you got this British dude, John Gray, book called False Dawn, The Delusions of Global Capitalism. My point, I guess, is that, it has come to the attention of lots of folks, the relationship between ideology and social structures. And this has not stopped to this day. So I like Naomi Klein, her book, This Changes Everything, where she points out the relationship between neoliberal economics and the assured destruction of the environment. There's other great folks doing the same thing now. I'm reading this cool book, was just published. It's called Becoming Abolitionists, Police Protests and the Pursuit of Freedom by a young African-American rights lawyer, Derica Purnell. And this is a book about the history of policing in the United States and how it started as a private enterprise to maintain the enslavement of people of color. And it has essentially not changed very much from its original intent, which is to preserve the interests of the property landowners and slave owners. So my point is I'm babbling a bit, but I think that's a good thing. And what we're witnessing now is incredibly horrific. People are hysterical right now. If you even point that out, let's remember that critical race theory does not say that all white people are racists. It is the opposite of that. The claim is that institutional structures are either inadvertently or intentionally designed to ensure inequitable outcomes. And so here we are, we've kind of peaked because right now, Frank Zappa said in 1980, after Ronald Reagan was elected, that the American public treats intelligent behavior as if it were some sort of hideous physical deformity. And that's where I think we're at the moment. We have literally declared it illegal to consider the possibility that we've got institutions that are skewed in the service of protecting particular ideologies. And of course, that's reflected. We got the anti-evolution stuff. We've got the anti-critical race theory. And then, of course, you got in Florida, Orange Hitler's offspring, DeSantis. You got the anti-woke law. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. We should talk more about this.
You can't say gay.
Yeah, can't say gay. And being woke is just a euphemism for being hostile to white people. And even though we have to talk about this down the trail a bit, I find it very ironic, the reactionary resistance, for example, just to the notion of wokeness, because Eric Hoffer, in his book, The True Believer, he says what happens is that once you become attached to a charismatic, popular leader, you essentially go to sleep. He says that there is a fact-proof screen erected around you to ensure that ideas bounce off you like rainwater cascading off a duck's ass in a hurricane. And so the idea of waking up is meant allegorically and literally to suggest that you should snap out of that trance. And not to go pedantic, but this is why America scares me right now because we have the attention span of gerbils and we're functionally illiterate and have forgotten our common history as citizens of Western civilization. Because in Plato's The Cave, you know The Cave, right?
Yep, absolutely.
If you look at most translations, the people at the bottom of the cave are ignorant and it's dark. And yet, when they are released from their chains in the cave, they don't run to the sunlight, which is metaphorically the truth. They have to be dragged out of the cave. And that's why Plato says we need leaders and we need people to be educated, because then and only then, he says, we have a society where people will not be asleep. So again, here's Plato at the dawn of Western civilization talking about enlightenment in terms of waking up. And then Freud, as you know, his definition of neurosis was dreaming while awake. In other words, you're not awake, you're sleepwalking in a stupor. All right, then you got James Joyce, page 9 of Ulysses. History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. Got Bob Marley, my favorite. Wake up and live. I'm not insisting that people agree with me, but I take issue with some of my buddies, including my close buddies. Jeff in Arizona, he's like, I'm sick of the woke people. They're just as bad as the Trumpists. And while the woke people can be sickening, I'm not sick of them because I see what they're asking of people to have the merit of being true. So my definition of wokeness is to notice how much of your life is the result of institutional structures. This is what C. Wright Mills says in The Power Elite in the 1950s. Because once you wake up to the fact, and the way that Mills puts it is, if you wake up and notice how much of what happens to you is the result of institutions rather than personal predilection, you might realize that you're not the only one, that other people have problems similar to yours. And this in turn might engender the kind of compassion that fosters collaboration in the service of making conditions better for everybody. All right, but enough ranting. Let's just talk about the broad skepticism, subjectivism, relativism, general suspicion of reason. Yeah, all of the above. I think one way of thinking of the postmodern movement, and I do believe this is true amongst English professors and New Age folks, the Birkenstock-clad, tofu-chomping people in my world, and that is that there's no such thing as truth, and therefore anything is true, and therefore what I think is no less true than what anybody else thinks. And yeah, that's unfortunate, and I think that's the postmodern notion at its worst, and that gets us to where we are today in a state of incipient fascism with, Kellyanne Conway, alternative facts, Giuliani, truth is not truth. You've got former President Trump who lies more than babies breathe. So 80% of what tumbles out of his oral cavity is factually incorrect. We have, to put it in Hannah Arendt's terms, we have lobotomized people to the point where they're no longer capable of engaging in a rational thought. And I think there's postmodernism really taken to its logical conclusion. It's just words chasing words, connected to nothing, because nothing's true. And let's proceed. Right. Having said that, though, let's just note and maybe move on that there are more nuanced kinds of skepticism, relativism, suspicion of reason, Skepticism is the basis of scientific inquiry. And it's only when you're mindlessly skeptical of anything or everything that it becomes, in my estimation, unfortunately problematic. The same thing with subjectivism. I'm very much in favor of each of us taking our phenomenological experiences quite seriously. But it becomes nihilistic or solipsistic. Is that a word?
Yes.
Okay. I knew it's a word, but I didn't know if I could pronounce it. But it just becomes anal cranial fusion when you get to the point where my view is, quote, true by virtue of it being my view. All right, relativism, we're going to have a lot more to say about this, but there's a lot of kinds of relativism. And not to get silly, but in part to buy me some time to think about what I'm actually going to say. But I think that there's some situations that are absolutely relative. And then there's others that are relatively absolute. And we need to really be careful as we wade through these ideas. You know, we could ask somebody, do you like the deep dish Chicago pizza? Or do you like the thin, New York pizza? And I would say, look, whatever you say is absolutely relative because you might favor one or the other. And yeah, that's relativism in a benign or benevolent fashion. All right, but a lot of absolutes turn out to be relative, right? Not to go all math, but we'll put Ken on the spot. What's the shortest distance between 2 points?
Straight line.
Nice. Relative to Euclidean geometry, because it's not a non-Euclidean. So let's just, as a preface for where we're going to head, note that just like all of the stupid false dichotomies, nature, nurture, and so on and so forth, I think it's unfortunate if we see relativism and absolutism as mutually exclusive points on a single continuum. I think it's more complicated than that. And then the general suspicion of reason, well, that goes back to Nietzsche's reaction to the Enlightenment. That's why he declares in The Gay Science that consciousness is the most calamitous stupidity by which we shall someday perish. But Nietzsche, while suspicious of reason, is not in any way suggesting that we abandon it entirely, which is the way that the postmodern sentiments at their extreme has drifted. And so I guess my point is that there are mindless forms of skepticism, subjectivism, relativism, and suspicion of reason. And then there's just very nuanced ones that have been around since the Enlightenment, just pointing out. You got Nietzsche, you got Mary Shelley with Frankenstein, but there were a boatload of people just saying that the Enlightenment, while it had some great components, also has caused us substantial duress by venerating reason and suggesting that we're on an inexorable road to progress that is paved solely by rationality to the exclusion of other human sensibilities.
We've been talking with social psychologist Sheldon Solomon on our divided country and related subjects. We're going to take a short break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. We're having a conversation about our divided society with social psychologist Sheldon Solomon.
Sheldon, before the break, you mentioned Nietzsche and the gay science. He's one of our favorite soothsayers, and I think he saw this stuff coming. Here's a quote from the gay science. "Where are we headed? Are we not endlessly plunging backwards, sideways, forwards, in all directions? Is there an up and down anymore? Do we not wander as if through an endless nothingness? Is this relativism?" Is Nietzsche describing our 21st century world?
Wow. I think he's definitely accurately characterizing our 21st century world, to be sure. Whether or not it is relativistic, I certainly think that's part of it. But let's face it, because this is right in the neighborhood of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he insists that we have to reevaluate all values in light of the fact, as he puts it in The Gay Science, he famously declares God is dead. But you need to read the rest of the paragraph. We've talked about this before. He then goes on to say Christianity has become unbelievable. And here he's not being cynical. He's just saying that a confluence of historical events, Darwin, the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment, market-based economy of unregulated capital, have rendered the Judeo-Christian worldview no longer convincing. And he said we are going to be in a state of psychological disarray for about 200 years, which means we got another half century. And I really think that he has insightfully predicted what was about to happen and what we now see happening. When you guys sent me that quote, I'm working with a Skidmore student, and her senior capstone experience is in French existential novels. And so last week we read Sartre, The Stranger. No, Camus, The Stranger.
Camus.
And, one of the lines in the middle is, everything is true and yet nothing is true. There you go, relativism and a fucking fortune cookie. And then Sartre's nausea. I looked anxiously around me. The present, nothing but the present. We have so much difficulty imagining nothingness. Now I knew things are entirely what they appear to be, and behind them, there is nothing. And so, yeah, I think that here we are, one of the books we never wrote. In the 20 years ago, the working title was A Cultural Animal in an Existential Age. And it was just based on, we wanted to expand on the paragraph in Nietzsche's book, explaining why once we lack a compelling view of reality that we share with a sufficient number of the fellow humans that we exist with in a community, this is highly problematic, both individually as well as interpersonally. And I think, just to get back to our broad theme for today, that, the overriding reason that we currently have the degree of divergence and polarization and difference is because we've lost that overarching view.
Maybe what we call, or what the postmodernists call, the meta-narrative. Skipping ahead a little, but are we now looking at the decline or the
decadent phase?
Or where we no longer have a firm, solid meta-narrative that we had in the 1950s in the victory culture. We don't now have, or let's say the country as a whole no longer has, because there are many people who still cling to that victory culture meta-narrative that we're the greatest country in the world and we're patriots and we salute the flag and all of that. But yet even those folks understand that that's not shared by everyone. And it doesn't describe the situation that they find themselves in. So that's a post-narrative concept as well, the whole absence of a meta-narrative.
Yeah. And so that's basically the main idea of Oswald Spengler's 2,000-page, 2-volume
Decline of the West.
Decline of the West. And Spengler's book is just a tribute to Nietzsche and Goethe. And that's what Spengler said. You said it, Ken. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but
yes, I am.
He says we are in the decadent phase. And people of goodwill can disagree about the particulars, but Spengler's point is that a culture is like a living entity. It is gestated, it comes to fruition, It has a life, and then over time, it is either abruptly terminated or dissipated. And what Spengler pointed out is that, there comes a point where you get to God is dead, and there is no longer an overarching shared view of reality. And he said what happens then is we're thrust back on ourselves. And so you have Otto Rank from Spengler saying, wow, when you don't have a worldview, you turn your body into a worldview. We're going to see more tattoos. We're going to see more piercings. We're going to see more narcissistic preoccupation with our personal development.
Cosmetic surgery.
There you go. Yoga. And this is not a pejorative indictment of people who do these things. And then he said there's just going to be a lot of cults. That you're going to have your fascists, you're going to have your fundamentalists, you're going to have your vegans, you're going to have your Yankee fans. And that the fact that we no longer have a shared, compelling vision of reality in no way undermines our need for those concerns to be addressed. And if they're not provided by the culture, we will seek them elsewhere.
And you may have a very solid worldview, a very solid belief in your Christian faith or whatever it is, and your patriotism, but you've got this nagging feeling, this nagging doubt that it's shared. And you don't have what Merlin Mowry calls a yes vote.
That's right.
Your culture's not giving you that, and you certainly don't have a cosmic yes vote.
That's right.
So what do you do? That's why we keep saying Trump is not the cause. He's a symptom of this malaise that's been going on for 30, 40 years.
Yes, but he is a malignant tumor above and beyond that malaise. And I think
in your humble opinion.
Yes. Yeah. No, in my humble opinion, he's uniquely dangerous. But he is capitalizing on the same forces. It was Eric Fromm who said in 1941, remember, he came to the U.S. to escape the Nazis, and Escape from Freedom was originally going to be a book about the psychology of Nazism. And then he got here and he said Americans are actually more prone to become fascists than the Nazis. And he then began to think about that. And he said, look, the fertile grounds for fascism is the alienated individual. And here we are.
Here we are.
Yeah.
Sheldon, Steve and I are always talking about Princeton philosophy professor Michael Sugrue, who was part of the teaching company in the 1980s. And now he's posted all of his content on YouTube. And if you're not familiar with it, you definitely should check it out. But his lecture on French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard, he says, we're all talking past each other. We're all speaking separate languages. And he references the abortion issue as an example. How does this resonate with you?
Yeah, I'm not familiar enough with his work, and I need to catch up to you guys to necessarily speak directly about his use of abortion as an example. But I like the idea in general, and I think it's just a logical extension of postmodernity, where people talk all the time, but words are meaningless unless they're associated with thoughts or the words have some external reference. And most people talking these days, they may as well be lobotomized. What they're saying is just a mindless reflection of the scripts that they've adopted from their specific overlords, be they left or right. And there's very little in the way of conversation.
You mean Democrats aren't pedophile cannibals?
No, they're not.
Oh, okay.
And so anyway, so I do think that there's a lot of that going on. But again, I would stipulate that it's not symmetrical in the sense that this will sound politically partisan, but it has the merits of being true. Right now, there is no effort by people who identify as Trump supporters. There's no pretense of telling the truth, making sense, trying to engage with another human being in a state of civil disagreement No, there's plenty of lefties that are equally mind-numbing, but I do believe that at their best, they're at least capable of stepping back and having a conversation that includes thoughts and ideas of their own. All right, having said that, though, I do think that the general idea is quite correct. We talk at each other and past each other, but we don't talk to each other. And this is highly problematic. It has been problematic for some time, but really problematic right now as the average American no longer lives in physical proximity to anybody that they might disagree with. This was not true in our youth. And this was also before, and again, I'm not blaming Trump for everything, but he was the first president of the United States to declare he was running for re-election before he was inaugurated, and who started his administration with the Hitler highlight film declaring that he had no interest in anyone who did not support him. And so I believe that this has created some of the circumstances that make any kind of meaningful conversation between Americans highly problematic. And by the way, back to Hannah Arendt, you need that for fascism. You know, the worst thing for fascists is people having real thoughts that they exchange with others. Remember that the word conscious means to know with. And that's why I'm really preoccupied right now with Fromm and Hannah Arendt when they talk about existential isolation and anxiety. That's the psychological impetus for grabbing on to a populist leader as if they're going to save you from drowning in a storm.
Sheldon, you brought up a very important term, which we hadn't really gotten into very much, relativism. And one of the problems is, of course, that we, like you say, we have absolutists, we have relativists. They're not mutually exclusive because they exist simultaneously. For example, the Catholic Church and some theologians, they say relativism is a denial of absolute truth, and it leads to moral license and a denial of the possibility of sin and of God. But yet, like I had said, they lack the whole support of the culture. So they're absolutists, and you can be an absolutist in many different parts of our society, like Greta Thunberg, for example, or Jordan Peterson, or Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident, but yet we have this culture that undermines the absolutists, undermines the beliefs. And I look at that as a severe problem that we're facing, which results in the skepticism, the malaise, the disillusionment. Would you comment on that as relativism at the heart of our secular social upheaval?
Yeah, how about maybe? I've got to say relatively. You knew that was going to happen. Honestly, Steve, this was the question that I was like, wow, I hope we have like 12 hours. Because you make a fine point that this idea that everything is relative and nothing can be absolute, that can be a hindrance, and indeed is. And yet, when I look at those particular quotes, it just made me, well, first of all, it made me dizzy because I'm like, oh, wow, these are kind of examples of relatively absolute statements. Because, of course, we got Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. This is one of the most uplifting statements. Although, note that the pursuit of happiness was not the original word.
It was the pursuit of wealth.
It was the pursuit of property or wealth.
Property.
All right, but the point is that, and you guys know this, Jefferson was a slaveholder. He raped Sally, the slave. And when he says all men are created equal, he did mean men, but only white men who happen to own property. So on the one hand, when we state this as an absolute, that's well-intentioned. And my favorite, and we may have talked about this in other venues, was Kurt Vonnegut, who I saw in the 1970s. And somebody said, "Why do you hate America?" And he turned purple and he said, "Don't go there. I love America. I just insist that America be in practice what it purports to be in principle." And then he went on to explain how it was the hypocrisy and the cognitive dissonance created by Jefferson's statement that necessitated racism as the psychological response. Because if all men are created equal, then black people must not be human, or else we would just be blatantly hypocritical. So anyway, here's an absolute framed in relative terms. Ditto for Jordan Peterson. He says a bedrock axiom of our culture, and one of the things we got right in the West, is the sovereign, responsible individual. There isn't anything more meaningful or real than the idea of individual sovereignty. And of course, the idea is real and meaningful. It's also wrong.
Right.
And so I wish we had Jordan here to talk more directly. One of my students was going to see him, I think, next week and tell him that I wanted to come on his podcast so we can talk about some of these things directly. But the point is I get on fine with Jordan. I would just point out that he should give John Locke some credit for this statement, because it was Locke who constructed the idea of a sovereign individual in the well-intentioned desire to create the conditions conducive to a democratic civil society. Right? So basically, Locke is resisting and resenting rulers by divine right. And it was by claiming that we're sovereign individuals that he was able to justify the notion of a civil society where decisions are made by the majority. And my point is, anyone who likes freedom should be like super psyched, high-fiving Locke and Jordan Peterson. And yet, this view of an individually sovereign person also happens to just be wrong. We are, in fact, the most uber social creatures. There really is no such thing as a sovereign individual. The point here for me would be, here's an idea that's foundational, the sovereign individual. But Locke then goes on to use that idea, which is not true, in order to justify neoliberal economics and why greed is good and people should selfishly pursue their interests without concern for those around them. And then even Greta Thunberg, she's right about there's no gray when it comes to environmental issues, because that's true. We are in a state, as you guys know, we're within a decade of the Earth not being fit for human habitation. It is unlike any other problem that humans have ever encountered in that there are no compromise solutions. We either, as Bill McKibben or Naomi Klein have pointed out, we either commit to doing something or not, because any half measure will not suffice. Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, is a Frankenstein conglomeration of non-optimal opportunities that is nevertheless better than nothing. But we can't do that with climate change. And yet, even here, I would respectfully submit, as much as I admire Greta, that even her statement is absolutely relative, because it's relative to human interests. Nature will be fine. 270 million years ago, when Earth got 10 degrees hotter, I think 90% of the life in the ocean and 75% of the life on land was extinguished. And it took 50 million years for the biodiversity to return. And that's like a nap in cosmic time. Yeah, so Greta's right. There's no gray for humans, plenty of gray for nature, however.
True.
Sheldon, when it comes to moral relativism, Noam Chomsky believes that there's a mental structure that we inherit. He says, quote, "You have extensive built-in innate structure, just as you can develop a human rather than an insect visual system, only it's guided by genetic instructions, very specific ones. The same is true of acquisition of language, of acquisition of arithmetical capacity, acquisition of a culture, hence acquisition of moral values. I believe animals also have a rudimentary mental structure. Social animals must have it. Ours is probably far more complex if it involves acquiring language and math. Do you agree with Jonathan Haidt and moral foundations theory that there are fundamental moral mental foundations that we inherit?"
Sort of. All right, so great, no, great question.
Relativistic answer.
Well, no, because, yeah, relativistically, again, props to Chomsky, but no serious evolutionary type takes his idea of a language acquisition device seriously today. But that's fine. Remember, he's writing these things 70 years ago. So if we forget about the particulars and just think about inherited mental structures, Chomsky is quite right. And this is the antithesis. Remember, Chomsky is writing these things in opposition to Skinner, who's just a 20th century blank slate dude. And Skinner, by the way, is just Marx without communism, because they're environmental determinists. They're just saying that if you modify external conditions, that humans are infinitely malleable. And the Chomskys of the world are saying that that's just simply not true. And I believe that to be the case. All right. Now, though, you ask about Haidt and fundamental moral mental foundations. Yes, I do think that there are, although once again, without getting into particulars, there's disagreement about his particular ones, right? So basically, I don't know if we need to go over like his 5 different flavors. If we do, then I'll have to look it up. But
we did it on a previous podcast.
Yeah, so basically, you've got deference to authority and purity. And that is what conservative folks tend to rely on when they make moral judgments. And then there's fairness and equity. And those are the aspects of morality that tend to be more heavily relied on by people who identify as liberal or progressive. My sense is that, they are both part of an inherited package of psychological proclivities that are a consequence of us being fundamentally cultural animals. That we are, and this is something that I think we need to make more prominent in the way that we think about things, because these ideas are subsequent to Becker's theorizing. And so these days, as much as I'm compelled by Becker's ideas and the truth tends to endure, it's also the case that his understanding of evolution and the development of culture was based on what we thought 70 or so years ago. And I now am a big fan of this dude, Joseph Henrich, and he's the chair of the anthropology department at Harvard, and he writes about cultural evolution. And what he says is that what we need to understand is that we're fundamentally cultural animals and that we're really not much smarter than other creatures as individuals. And he turns out to be right, that crows and dolphins and chimps are just as smart as most humans and smarter than most of the students in my class, as I keep telling them. What makes us so potent as a species is our capacity to traffic in shared cultural knowledge that is accumulated and passed on over time. We are the beneficiaries of thousands of generations of accumulated wisdom. And the point is that none of us would be alive by sundown if we were flown to some place in the middle of nowhere and divested of our accoutrements. I told my students the other day, let's do an experiment. We'll put a squirrel, my dog, and you in a helicopter, and let's go to the middle of the Adirondacks, and we'll just drop you there. And who's going to be alive the next day? I'm betting on the squirrel and the dog, and not you. All right, well, what's the point? Well, the point, according to Henrik, is that if the reason why we are so successful is that we're fundamentally cultural animals, this needs to somehow be reflected in the way that we behave. And this directs our attention to the role of social norms. And there's another dude that I'm fond of, a guy named Michael Tomasello, who writes about human development from an evolutionary point of view. And he talks about, he calls it shared intentionality. And he's like, this is what makes us so potent. It's not what's in our head, it's our capacity to cooperate and collaborate with other individuals, that's part of our tremendous success. But it's also our capacity to absorb and retain cultural knowledge. Right? And what the Tomasello dude points out is that those are two different developmental pathways, that over time, some of our interactions are with our peers when we're babies. And it is through those interactions that we develop a basic sense of fairness and equity. But at the same time that that's happening, we're also more passive recipients of cultural wisdom that we get from our ancestral forebears. And my point is that this is important because what we can see is that the aspects of morality that conservatives are most concerned about are ones that are acquired in deference to authorities, whereas the ones that the liberals rely on emerge more directly from horizontal interactions between people, equal power. Irregardless, though, norms are not, from this perspective, just arbitrary stupidities. They are ways of fixing cultural ideas so that we share the same beliefs in a way that allows us to cooperate, put a hyphen between co and operate, and coordinate. And the evolutionary types say that this is reflected in our basic tendency to be overly concerned about what other people think about us and to adhere particularly rigorously to external norms. So there's a very famous series of studies, and I'll shut up soon, but it's with little kids and apes. And so let's say that you're showing a little kid how to open a wooden box, and you're going to get like a knife or something. Let's not use a knife because there's little kids. All right, so let's use a screwdriver to open a wooden box. And so you have an ape sitting next to a kid, and you're like, okay, we're going to open the box. All right, but what you do is before you pick up the screwdriver to open the box, you do some kind of like Buddhist thing where you appear to be praying, and then maybe you clap your hands 3 times, and then you open the box. And then you walk away, and the question is, what does the ape do, and what does the human do? Well, what the ape does is it runs and it grabs the tool, and it opens the box. It doesn't do anything like the Gouda and clapping, because that's clearly irrelevant. It has nothing to do with what is instrumentally necessary in order to open the box. Kids will exactly imitate those behaviors. Moreover, if another kid comes in and doesn't do that, they will get angry and punitive. Right, what's the point here? It's not that people are docile or stupid. It's that in order to maintain a suite of cultural knowledge and pass it over time, because that knowledge is often not explicit. In other words, culture is smarter than any of us. We know a lot, but we don't know that we know it. And the predisposition to adhere to social norms is the bedrock of that. Is you need to fix norms in order for there to be any degree of coordination or cohesion. Right, where the terror management end of it comes in is in conditions where existential or physical threats arise, at which point our subscription to those norms becomes more profoundly amplified.
So, Sheldon, your co-writer and buddy Tom Pasinski had said once that there is no absolute truth, but he looked at that as something that was liberating and that he was able to live comfortably with. But in my mind, it contradicts what we just said about Chomsky and Haidt talking about these moral foundations. Is it possible to agree with both Chomsky, Haidt, and with Tom Pasinski, who said there's no absolute truth?
Yeah, I'll try. If my buddy Tom was here, I would ask where he gets his psychoactive substances so that I get some of the same. Because without getting into an epistemological pissing match, there can be absolute truth. And we can, rather than say there is none, just acknowledge our incapacity to ever attain it. So, but that's just a point of trivia for when I'm hanging out with my buddy again. When I saw that question, my buddy Tom, by the way, is a lot smarter than me, maybe all of us together, Jeff too, but I don't remember the last time he read a book. And I think I saw that and I'm like, wow, you're talking about Heidegger without even knowing it. Because what Tom was saying in Tom speak, and I'm, again, he's one of my best friends, and I mean this as a compliment, is it harkens back to Heidegger's moment of vision in light of the recognition that life is not intrinsically meaningful, that is instigated by the awareness of one's mortality. So you got Heidegger saying that we have angst, this anxiety, this feeling of being unsettled and not at home. And that gives us the proverbial fork in the road, and that for some, there is the flight from death that reduces you to a culturally constructed meat puppet marching to the beat of somebody else's drum. Well, there's Haidt. There's the people clinging to authority and purity. Those are the folks that give us Hitler, according to Hannah Arendt. But Heidegger, leaning on Kierkegaard, points out that angst is both sympathetic as well as antipathetic, that we flee from anxiety, but we are also attracted to it. I love the way that Heidegger puts it, although I'll probably butcher it because he's using Kierkegaard here. The idea that anxiety is yourself summoning yourself to find yourself. It's basically deep inside your own self, as Heidegger puts it, clamoring for attention in the hopeful prospect that you will be able to shed the cultural construction masquerading as yourself and find yourself in the process. And this is what Tom means by the prospect of this being quite liberating. Back to Heidegger, he's like, you can have that anxiety clears, it just literally blows a hole in your culturally constructed vision of reality, where you can realize that you are ultimately contingent cultural caricature. I'm Sheldon Solomon in the 21st century. I could have been a goat herder in Mongolia, but I'm not. And Kierkegaard's point is once you see that, the arbitrary and contingent nature of existence, yeah, that's when you realize that life has no intrinsic meaning. Now, while that could be existentially devastating, it could also be a joyous opportunity to, as Goethe put it, recognize that the purpose of life is living. And so then you've got Heidegger saying, wow, well, what happens to you if you're able to go in that direction? You know, what Tom would consider to be the liberating end of things. And he's like, well, you know, like Buddha, enlightenment is quite ordinary. The world hasn't changed much. You're still an ambulatory cultural artifact, but everything looks different because you're able, by virtue of your awareness, to recognize Kierkegaard defined consciousness as the possibility of possibilities. And while that could be daunting to some, the idea of the prospect of a world in which there are no absolutes gives us, in principle, a host of choices that we could make for ourselves that are ultimately not only psychologically uplifting, but interpersonally benevolent.
And still have the moral foundations.
That's correct. So for the Heideggers of the world, and this is an important point, and thank you, Steve. With all due respect to religious authorities, it is not the case that you need absolutes for moral systems to function. They evolutionarily are not absolute. What's absolute is the need to have social norms, but the way they are manifested is culturally relative. And what I say to the Skidmore students, and it has no effect because, again, they don't read, but I'm like, I
hope they're hearing this.
I do. I'm like, well, I don't know if they're hearing because they don't look at me. They're looking at their devices. But I'm like, you should take a quick look at the Pope's encyclicals. The Pope Francis is a really cool relativistic Pope. And he's actually one of the most interestingly progressive folks, trying to kind of have it both ways right now, trying to hold up a worldview that is potentially compelling to large amounts of humanity, while at the same time making it a pretty big tent and willing to loosen up some of the cultural mandates in ways that I find kind of getting halfway between a fundamentalist and a secular humanist world.
So just going back for a moment to the fact that we have a missing worldview right now, or no worldview. In Eastern thought, there's a role for nothingness in meditation. Letting go in the mind then allows all things a fuller reality to enter. Are we in a cultural meditation where we might be served by allowing for a period of experiencing a kind of collective nothingness?
Yeah, wow, great question.
What might that sort of social breathing mean practically?
Wow. Okay, that's more than one question. Don't do that to me.
I know.
No, those are awesome questions. Now, again, I'm preoccupied right now with Eric Fromm because I've just been teaching Escape from Freedom, where Fromm makes an interesting point. Again, 1940s, he says that one of the distressing elements of life in the United States is the degree of frenetic activity that the average person engages in, primarily to ensure that they never sit still long enough to have an actual thought. And a big element right now, Kenneth and Ken and Steve and everybody, Goldie Laura, is the positive psychologists who I sometimes get annoyed with, but they're now emphasizing the importance. It's through the mindfulness notion, but just the idea of contemplation, just to give us the conditions that might be more conducive for the kinds of reflection that I think we all agree might be one antidote to just keeping ourselves comfortably numb by never sitting still long enough to do otherwise. Now, give me the second part of the question again, though.
What might that sort of social breathing mean from a practical standpoint?
Wow. You don't know. I have to get back to you on that. But to be silly, I think we need to, well, the hope is that it would restore the conditions conducive to personal growth and interpersonal interactions that are not necessarily perfused with discord, ensuring that we talk past each other. Now, that's not a particularly useful statement, given that you framed it in terms of what's practical. But what I'm perseverating about these days, another thing that I've been teaching a lot is Daniel Kahneman, the guy who won the Nobel Prize for his fast and slow thinking. Do you guys know that distinction? So Kahneman, Princeton psychologist, the only psychologist ever to win a Nobel Prize in economics, and the only to win a Nobel Prize in anything. But his point is that there's two basic cognitive systems. So he calls them System 1 and System 2. System 1 is fast thinking, and this is what most of us do for most of our waking moments. And it has nothing to do with the active use of our intellect in the service of the rational pursuit of truth. It is just the reliance on heuristic models of experience that allows us to make our way through the day, generally fine, but we're on autopilot.
Designed to keep you alive.
That's correct. And basically, that's the average person. We are capable of rational thought, but it is not our default state. That's slow thinking, according to Kahneman. And that's where you step back. You are explicit in your awareness of thinking about something. And it is under those conditions that we make the most progress in terms of advancing rational discourse. In my world, like I say, I think that current circumstances ensure that the average individual spends relatively no time engaged in actual thought, and that I would like us to, as a society, think about, and I have no idea, frankly, Kenneth's right, we're kind of trying to think these days in terms of pragmatic applications, but the closest I've come for the moment as a teacher in a college setting is to try and create conditions that might foster this kind of protracted contemplation. And this is just, maybe this is silly, but one thing I've noticed at Skidmore, and I don't know if this is everywhere, but most of the professors at Skidmore, we have classes, they're like 50 minutes long or they're 80 minutes long. And the professors almost always end their class at the end of the time period. And this doesn't make me a better human, although it might. I end my classes when I'm done for the day. And what that means is that sometimes an 80-minute class will last for 20 minutes, and the kids will sit there in a stupor as if they're being denied if I don't just say shit for another hour. And they're like, well, what are we supposed to do? And I'm like, yeah, what are we supposed to do? So the last line of Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man is there's a young woman fighting for social justice. And Marcuse asks, well, what are you going to do? And she says, I don't know. For the first time in my life, I'm going to get to think about what it is that I would like to do. And my point is that it's actually astonishing how unsettled the students are with the prospect of just time where I'm not dictating to them what they should be doing. And I'm like, there's no syllabus in life. Why don't you do something? Ideally related to what we're doing, but if not,
hopefully something useful.
Take a walk.
Right. There's no syllabus in life.
That's a good quote.
You know, Sheldon, we always like to get to the idea of hope, where we can find hope. In the past, we've all talked about the classic Becker solution, which is opportunities for heroism. We've talked about the death positive movement together, humility and gratitude. We've talked about flow, one of my favorites.
Yep.
But you and Kenneth Miller, our buddy Kenneth Miller, who was shy about getting on microphone, but he's making his thinking known. He has talked about an ethics of all things have standing that asks of us tenderness and yields festivity. This from Sylvia Benso and All Things Have Standing and the Spark Hunter file. Would you comment on this as an opportunity for hope?
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity for hope. We've had these talks. It seems like it's going on decades.
20 years.
That's 20 years.
Yeah, all right. So we've been doing this for quite a while. And we have always, I believe, been in broad agreement that Becker's account of human behavior is rather profound and compelling. And I would submit, if you add on top of that the terror management theory research, to be annoying, I would say that at this point that only the willfully ignorant or intellectually dormant can deny that existential concerns have a pervasive effect on human affairs. Moreover, I think we agree with the Robert J. Lifton, the psychohistorian, in the book Destroying the World to Save It, where, and Lifton, of course, knows Becker's work and agrees with it. And we know from our experiments that when we remind people that they're going to die, that it just makes them prejudiced and aggressive and fascistic and antagonistic to nature and just mindless consumers of money and stuff. And when it comes to the end of the denial of death, Becker's like, wow, the average Americans either spends their time drinking or shopping, which is the same thing. And clearly he's not suggesting that we do that, but he has nothing beyond saying, wow, yeah, I don't really know what to do. Just do something and incinerate yourself in the process, where he's like, make yourself an offering to the life force. And Kenneth and we go way back, and we met originally in the context of our mutual interests in Becker. We should annoy him and get him someday to tell us how you bumped into these ideas to begin with. But Kenneth approached me and he's like, I have this idea. I'd like to do a dramatic podcast that conveys Sylvia Benso's ideas about our ethical obligation to things. And there were two things that caught my eye. One is that he wanted to do a podcast, that he was interested, and originally, it might have been a film, but it was a drama. And this goes back to Greg Bannock 30 years ago, running up to me in Seattle when I was lecturing. And he's like, dude, you're a non-pharmacological intervention for insomnia. Anyone that you're talking to either agrees with you already or they're not going to listen to you. If we want to make efforts to disseminate these ideas broadly in a way that they might be engaging and effective, we got to do it through art, not through academic psychobabble. So that was the first thing before I even saw the drama, which is magnificent. So the other thing that excited me was when Kenneth told me that the ideas in it were inspired by Sylvia Benso. And me being me and coming from New Jersey and having graduated from high school and college unscathed by knowledge, I read the script to the drama. And I was like, this is fucking excellent, because it really is. It stands on its own merits. But because Kenneth asked me to be of use with regard to the ideas themselves as they related to Becker, I'm like, damn, now I'm going to have to read Benso. So we get the book, The Face of Things. Was it Another Side of Ethics? Is that it? But anyway, I'm really hooked by the first page or two, where basically Benso adopts Heidegger's position, which is that philosophy took a wrong turn a couple of thousand years ago, and we're still paying the price for it today. And that the result of that price is genocidal atrocities and environmental destruction. So she starts her philosophical inquiry with a very practical claim, and that is that we will not be able to effectively address two of the most daunting problems currently confronting us, that being the environment and ongoing ethnic hostilities culminating in genocidal atrocities, without a fundamental alteration of ethical sensibilities. And what she proposes is that we use the ideas of Martin Heidegger to supplement the ideas of Emmanuel Levinas in order for that to happen. And it is from that we get an ethic of things. Right, classic comic book, what Benso gets from Levinas is the idea that our primary and fundamental ethical obligation is not to ourselves, as Western philosophy often has it, which is narcissistic kind of morality or ethics that gets us to where we are today. Levinas was all about the primary obligation of humans is the metaphorical and literal response to the appeal of another. And so Levinas is relational. He's like, we are uber social creatures, and metaphorically, the face of every other human essentially compels us to engage with them in a manner that places their needs as more primary than ours. And basically, the appeal of the other is, I am here, I exist, and the ethical obligation to the other is based on the moral imperative, thou shalt not kill. All right, so you've got Levinas really shifting attention away from an individual ethic to one in which ethics essentially becomes the metaphorical space between us in a world in which we are fundamentally connected to and ultimately dependent on those around us. Well, what Benso does is to admire Levinas while at the same time criticizing him for, one, being overly patriarchal, because it appears that, and this is, people of goodwill could disagree about this, but he appears to be thinking primarily about men interacting. I don't know about that, but what I do know is more explicitly, Levinas, our obligations to others refer just to other humans. Right, now, there are other Levinas scholars who say, well, Levinas shouldn't have stopped there. If we have obligations to fellow humans, what about to dolphins? What about to dogs? All right, well, what Benso does is to say, well, that's not enough. And she relies on Heidegger's understanding of the notion of a thing. And this is rather complicated, and it sounds kind of metaphysical because it is of sorts, but Heidegger's point is that for the most part, we see things in an anthropomorphic utilitarian sense as being only interesting and important to the extent that they are of practical use. Heidegger's point is that a thing exists in its own right, independent of what it means to us or what use it might have for us, and moreover, that everything not only literally exists in its own right, but has its own history that he describes, I think, in a rather lovely way as a gathering of, to put it another way, just a gathering of events culminating in the present moment where things have standing in their own right. All right, now back to Benso. She says, I want to take Heidegger's claim that all things have standing, and I want to apply Levinas's ethical mandate that we have an obligation to respectfully attend to everything. And what she says, if we were to do that, that would result in a kind of stance towards life that she describes as tenderness. All right, now more work needs to be done, and actually Kenneth's account of tenderness is more profound and tender than my own. But tenderness is a stance towards life, not a sentimental Valentine's Day Hallmark card. And what Benso does beautifully is to break up the word tenderness and to point out that it's both a noun and a verb. To tend means to actively care for and to be willing to modify what one does in careful concern of that entity. It requires attention, which means that you're actually paying attention to those things around you. And Benso's point is that tenderness is a stance towards life that is potent, it's powerful, it is goal-directed, it is rational and persistent. And while it will not in any way eradicate evil, it may put us in a position to alter our surroundings in a manner that somehow pushes the evil into smaller and smaller corners of the world, both literally and metaphorically. And then she goes on to say that, okay, well, how would we know if we're being tender? And from that, she develops the notion of festivity. And she's like, a tender person will be festive. And here she's drawing that word from the ancient Greek notion of a festival. And the point is that when I ask them what's a festival, they're like, oh, I know, that's where you drink as much as you can and tear off your clothes and see how many people you can assault in X number of minutes. And of course, that's one kind, that's an orgy. That's not a festival. A festival for Benso, and she goes to great lengths to establish this through scholarship, is actually when we transform a secular time and space into a mystical experience. She's like, look, when you have a festival, it could be held in a place that is usually pretty common. It could be a parking lot. And yet, during the festival itself, you are in a different phenomenological state of awareness. Of course, you're there in that time and place, but most festivals also have a time-altering dimension where you pay homage to what used to be in the form of recognition of ancestral influences. at the same time that festivals often direct our attention collectively to what's going to happen in the future. And so her point is that festivals at their best give us a form of secular prayer. They don't have to be religious at all to be profound. And then her last step, it is the last one in the book, is when she says, now what I want to do is to take the state of mind that arises in a festival setting and make that, to the best of our ability, the way that we live day to day. And so she literally says it would be good if we can get to the point where we had a festive take on life itself. Now, I don't know if I've done justice to benzo or to Kenneth's use of benzo, but I find it very appealing, in part because benzo says at the end of her book that festivity is a non-pathological way to manage anxieties engendered by mortality. So there's the connection between Becker and terror management theory. And to get back to where we started, it's that the concern about our original articulation of Becker's ideas in the context of terror management theory is that it sure looked like the only way to manage existential anxiety is by self-esteem. And yet, self-esteem, as Virginia Woolf points out, in A Room of One's Own, is often acquired. You make yourself look big by making somebody else look small. And that self-esteem implies an effort to inflate yourself. And this is particularly problematic in a narcissistic culture. So self-esteem is still extraordinarily important, but I think there's a number of ways to acquire it that do not necessitate feeling as if you have to be better than those around you. And so I see festivity in the same pile of life-enhancing affectations along the lines of mindfulness, contemplation, flow. And I look forward to us in the future integrating those different constructs. But I am compelled by this idea of tenderness as an overarching stance towards life, not a sentiment, but rather as a superordinate way of guiding our existence.
And perhaps if our society could embrace tenderness as a way of dealing with one another and find a way to celebrate that in festivity, that might be a way to bring us together.
Yeah. Okay, so
that's hopeful. You were asking for hopeful.
I'm looking for
that's
hope.
Hopeful.
Right.
That's hopeful.
That's hopeful.
Yeah, wait a minute. So let me just peck away on this a second. So have you heard of this guy, David Graeber?
No.
All right, so there's a guy named David Graeber. He just died. He's an archaeologist and an anthropologist, and he's written some of my favorite books, The History of Debt, a book called Bullshit Jobs, and then his most recent book is called The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. It was just released in November. And the Graeber, and it's written by another guy, David Wengrow, also. But their point is that our current view of anthropology and archaeology is very Western, very white, very patriarchal, and very much appears to infer that the way things are the way that they ought to be. So they mock, like Steven Pinker in the beginning of this book, because in Pinker's latest books, he's like, everything's great.
It's getting better, no
it's
poverty.
Getting better.
Yep.
Well, their point is first of all, that's just wrong, but that's not their main point. What they urge is a broader survey of human history that is not confined to the white man's burden. And they say there are plenty of societies throughout history. They use the word tenderness. And they're mostly matriarchal cultures that are rather egalitarian, but they're not necessarily hunters and gatherers. He's like, well, if you read Pinker, the only way you can have a city or a cosmopolitan environment is a heavily hierarchical one that is inequitable, where there's going to be massive exploitation. It just can't be otherwise. And his point is that, yeah, it can't be otherwise if you don't consider that it has been otherwise historically. And so my point is that the one thing that we want to preempt is just this idea that this is naive and not even in the domain of human possibility. Because the fact of the matter is that at our best, we're profoundly pro-social and capable of care and tenderness.
We've been talking with Sheldon Solomon about our divided country and related issues. Sheldon, thank you for a terrific conversation.
You are very welcome. I like being here, and lunch was awesome. Thank you, Goldie.
Thank you.
I hope you'll be our guest again. It's always a pleasure.
Oh, count me in anytime.
All right.
Okay.
Man.
Thank you. We've been talking with social psychologist Sheldon Solomon about our divided country and related subjects. Steve, what are your takeaways?
Well, my overall takeaway is that Sheldon basically agreed with us about postmodernism, relativism, and our other explanations for our divided society. And if you're someone who dismisses postmodernism, I don't blame you. There's a lot to disregard. But hang in there. Hopefully it will make some sense. We started with very current ideas. From there, Sheldon diverted a bit to remind us of terror management theory and the works of Ernest Becker.
Yeah, he said terror management theory was designed to corroborate Ernest Becker's view, which is that our concerns about death give rise to potentially debilitating anxiety that we try to manage by embracing our cultural worldviews that give us a sense that life has meaning and that we have value. When existential anxieties arise, we tend to cling tenaciously to our worldview.
Which in this case might include being suspicious of social norms like traditional medicine. Then we got into this postmodern philosophical framework that is characterized by broad skepticism, subjectivism or relativism, a general suspicion of reason, and an acute sensitivity to the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power. We said we were struck by Jean-François Lyotard, who in 1979 described what sounds a lot like our contemporary America. Sheldon looked at a relativistic notion that, quote, there's no such thing as truth, and therefore anything is true, and therefore what I think is no less true than what anybody else thinks. Obviously, this is problematic, and we end up with things like alternative facts.
But Sheldon compounded the discussion when he said, quote, keep in mind more nuanced kinds of skepticism are the basis of scientific inquiry. But he was wary of contemporary assertions like, my view is, quote, true by virtue of it being my view. Really glad he took issue with that.
Right.
We talked about Nietzsche. Sheldon said, he's accurately characterizing our 21st century world. According to Sheldon, Nietzsche said, we are going to be in a state of psychological disarray for about 200 years, which means we've got at least another half century to go.
How we know that, who knows? But I won't be here, so I don't care.
Barzoon says the same thing.
Pretty much. So we got into the postmodern notion of meta-narrative. Sheldon agreed that, quote, we as a society lack a compelling shared view of reality. The overriding reason that we currently have the degree of divergence and polarization and difference is because we've lost that overarching view, which in postmodern is called the meta-narrative.
Sheldon said, quote, you get to God is dead, and there is no longer an overarching shared view of reality. The fact that we no longer have a shared compelling vision of reality in no way undermines our need for those concerns to be addressed. And if they're not provided by the culture, we will seek them elsewhere.
Boy, that's an important point. And I think that we need to stress that often and everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we should remind our listeners also that God may not be dead for everyone in our world, but the strength of belief in God and our dependence on religion to provide the meta-narrative that we used to live by now takes a back seat to secular things like money, power, achievement, fame, and beauty. We looked at some of the dangers in all this, and Sheldon noted that, quote, the fertile grounds for fascism is the alienated individual. And we've explored the ideas of alienation before.
Absolutely. Sheldon also said we're fundamentally cultural animals. The predisposition to adhere to social norms is the bedrock of that. You need to fix norms in order for there to be any degree of coordination or cohesion. According to terror management theory, in conditions where existential or physical threats arise, our subscription to those norms becomes more profoundly amplified.
The existential issue, as Sheldon sees it, is once you see the arbitrary and contingent nature of existence, that's when you realize that life has no intrinsic meaning. Now, while that could be existentially devastating, it could also be a joyous opportunity to recognize that the purpose of living is living. The idea of the prospect of a world in which there are no absolutes gives us, in principle, a host of choices that we could make for ourselves that are ultimately not only psychologically uplifting, but interpersonally benevolent. I think that's a key concept, that the absence of absolutes or the absence of universal absolutes or cosmic absolutes can be psychologically devastating or enriching depending on who you are.
That's very true. And Sheldon said, with all due respect to religious authorities, it is not the case that you need absolutes for moral systems to function. They evolutionarily are not absolute. What's absolute is the need to have social norms. But the way they are manifested is culturally relative.
That's a hard one for some of us to accept.
Yeah, me included.
Yeah, well, the more you think about it, if you get your head wrapped around it, you understand that science is squarely behind that notion that morality is not dependent on absolutes. And we've talked about this with various other people in various contexts before.
Yes, that's for sure. My favorite line of the day, there's no syllabus in life. It reminds me of the psychology assertion that we can only understand life by looking at it backwards, but we are compelled to live it forwards.
Yeah.
So there's no syllabus in life. Don't you wish you had a teacher like Sheldon when you were in school?
Well, when I was in school so long ago, I think Socrates was teaching. So, yeah, I would.
I think that you're probably right about that. Me too.
We were looking for hope.
As we always are.
And we got into a conversation about philosopher Sylvia Benso and her book, The Face of Things. And these ideas came to us from our good friend Kenneth Miller. In the interest of time, we're going to say her ideas, Benso's ideas, are based on Emmanuel Levinas and Martin Heidegger and have a very hopeful and appealing quality. They help us address the environment and ongoing ethnic hostilities.
Sheldon says, ethics essentially becomes the metaphorical space between us in a world in which we are fundamentally connected to and ultimately dependent on those around us.
He said that, according to Benso, tenderness is a stance towards life. Festivity is a non-pathological way to manage anxieties engendered by mortality. Perhaps if our society could embrace tenderness as a way of dealing with one another and find a way to celebrate that in festivity, in person, that might be a way to bring us together.
Yeah. Sheldon ends with, quote, at our best, we're profoundly pro-social and capable of care and tenderness. These are important ideas, Steve.
Important ideas as always. Folks, join us next time. Like us on Facebook. Please recommend us to your friends. Email your feedback or leave a comment or an Apple Podcast review. Let us know what you want and how we can improve. Become a part of our community of people who value these important ideas, and you can find us at www.thehubforimportantideas.com.
And support us on Patreon at www.patreon.com/thehubimportantideas. We are 100% listener supported.
And please check out our award-winning documentary video series, Conversations with Solomon, Exploring Human Motivation, on YouTube. Thank you for listening to The Hub for Important Ideas. I'm Steve James.
And I'm Ken Swain.
Special thanks to our friend and colleague Kenneth Miller for his thoughtful contributions, Goldie James for audio engineering,
and our friend Laura C. for her photography.
Stay safe, everybody.
Stay well.
This has been a Contemporary Heroism Initiative production.